Dr. Scott Bonn is on the road. You can visit docbonn.com to find a date near you and purchase tickets. August 4th, you can find Doc Bonn at the City Winery, St. Louis. That's DOCBONN.com for tour dates and ticket purchases.
This morning, Doc Bonn?
I am great. How are you?
Doing good. How are you
Good
doing?
to be here.
I'm good now.
Hey, you've got a lot of really interesting topics in your latest book, Why We Love Serial Killers. And I think we want to dive a little bit deeper into that today. I think we really want to kind of focus on the psychology of female serial killers today. What are the primary motivations behind female serial killers, and how do they differ from their male counterparts?
Well, great question. And the contrary to popular mythology, there actually are female serial killers. You know, one of the myths out there is that they're all sort of dysfunctional male loners, young guys live out in the woods, you know, like the Tooth Fairy or Buffalo Bill, you know, from the Silence of the Lambs fame. But in fact, you are correct. There definitely are female serial killers, and their desires, motivations definitely are different from those of men. They kill differently than male serial killers, and they do so for different reasons. So male serial killers, first of all, they tend to be much more physical and use means of killing that require strength, such as strangulation. They also are much messier. They're much more likely to use knives to disfigure and defile the bodies, whereas women are much more likely to use more passive ways of killing. For example, poison, or perhaps smothering is another example. You probably heard of the arsenic and old lace killers, or the black widows. You know, they're the ones that tend to use these, as I said, these more silent methods of killing, often poison. And when they do kill, it is for different reasons. Men often will kill for power and control reasons, or perhaps sexual desires, but in the case of women, it is much more likely to be for either financial gain. And again, that brings to mind the Black Widow, who will kill someone for insurance money, that sort of thing. Or for sometimes even in their own mind, an altruistic reason. You have the nurses, whether it be in a hospital or a nursing home, where they think they're putting people out of their misery, but in fact, they actually become serial killers. So their motives tend to be much less driven by sexual fantasies or a need for power, control, and domination. As I said, they typically fall into a category of serial killer called comfort and gain. They're looking for something that satisfies them, often in a material sense, as opposed to a psychological, sexual sense.
That's super interesting. Can you, explain a little bit more why female serial killers are more likely to kill for profit or revenge rather than sexual gratification? What is it, the difference between men and women, that kind of drives that?
Well, yes, it gets to I think both nature and nurture. You know, women are just biologically different than men. They tend to be, much more the nurturers in society, and are not as driven by the primal instincts of killing and sexual motives. So it's partially, I think, innate, genetic in terms of women, but it's also the way that women are socialized. They're socialized in our society to be the caregivers, the caretakers, which is why you have the women who will sometimes actually think that they're putting people out of their misery by killing them. But again, they seek their own comfort and gain, which is why they will kill and then defraud for insurance money. But one of the most infamous female serial killers, who's actually very typical of the female serial killer, is Dorothy Puente. She was a Latino elderly serial killer out in California. And what she would do is she had a rooming house, and she would bring elderly people into her rooming house, and then she would take control of their finances, their Social Security, their insurance, things like that. She would milk them dry, and then when she was finished, she would kill them and bury them in her backyard. So that's a very, very typical example of a female serial killer. Now, interestingly, perhaps the most infamous serial killer of all time, your audience may be familiar with Aileen Wuornos, who was portrayed in a tremendous film adaptation of this story, Monster, starring Charlize Theron. She actually won the Academy Award for it. And now Aileen Wuornos actually was very atypical of female serial killers, because she shot her victims with a gun, and she did so out of anger and retaliation. And she was actually killing male clients. She was a prostitute and who would pick up men along the highway, or they would pick her up on the highway, and she would then kill her Johns, her clients. And she did so because she had suffered a lifetime of torture and torment at the hands of men. So she was retaliating. And I firmly believe that the primary reason that we who study these things, or even in pop culture, probably know Aileen Wuornos and Monster more than any other female serial killer, is because she killed like a man. She was violent. She was very, very violent. And that's atypical of the female killer. And it stands out. And I think that's why she got so much notoriety.
Now, with her being such an atypical female serial killer, did that kind of allow her more time to kill, more time for the police to kind of be baffled?
No, her killings all took place in about 1 year. So no, she wasn't particularly sophisticated at covering her tracks. She would just switch cars. She would kill a client and then take his car. It took them a little while to connect the dots, but she was not. She was not a planner. She would just randomly stand out on the highway. Whoever picked her up, that's who she would kill. She'd rob them and kill them. So there's really two types of serial killers. There's an organized category and a disorganized category. And the organized category are the cold-blooded planners, like the Ted Bundys and the Jeffrey Dahmers, who meticulously plan their killings and go out of their way to great lengths to conceal the bodies and cover up their tracks. They're the ones that oftentimes get away with it for a much longer period of time because they're very meticulous. The Aileen Wuornos fell more into the category of disorganized. I mean, she was organized to the extent that she brought a gun. She knew she was going to pick someone up along the highway, but she didn't cover her tracks very well.
Do you feel that female serial killers share a psychological common trait with male?
Well, again, there's different categories of serial killers, but maybe we should, I think it's a good time to discuss that. Serial killers are not one size fits all. there's again this common myth that they're all the same, that they're all young men, dysfunctional, kind of strange loners driven by by sexual fetishes, and that's just not the case. Serial killers, there are groups of them that are driven by power, control, and domination. Like I said, and those tend to be men. There's another category that's called a thrill killer, and that's an individual who simply kills for the excitement of killing. And the Zodiac, for example, would be in that category. Another serial killer, his name was Richard Ramirez. They called him the Night Stalker. He fell into that category. You have another category of serial killer called they're called visionary serial killers, and these are serial killers who believe they are being compelled to kill by some outside authority or higher power. And the infamous David Berkowitz, son of Sam, falls into this category because he believes Satan was telling him to kill. But again, women, most female serial killers fall into this category of comfort and gain. So in terms of the psychological need that's being fed, what they're looking for is this desire for their own safety and security and comfort that is gained somehow through the killing.
I think society has a lot to do with that.
Well, again, I think it's a combination of nature and nurture, and it has something to do with the genetic makeup of women who are genetically created to be the caretakers and the nurturers in society, and then we socialize women to do that to even a greater extent. The traditional female values of motherhood and caretaking and nurturing. So all of this, I think, leads into and helps to channel the way that when women decide to kill, the way they act out. And interestingly, we didn't talk about this, but I think it's important to make this distinction. And that is, if you look at all the killers in the United States, all the murderers, about 90% of them are men. So murder is definitely, more often than not, a male thing, if you will. But among serial killers, interestingly, 15%, so 50% more likely that serial killers will be a female. Now, it's still a relatively low percentage, 15% versus 85% for men, but they're overrepresented relative to men. So I actually, in my show, that you mentioned up front, I will say that women, not that many women kill, but when they do so very effectively, and they tend to do it prolifically. And I mean that somewhat tongue in cheek, but the females who do become serial killers are at least as prolific and as good at it as their male counterparts, perhaps even better. And maybe that's because, once again, they're driven by not the compulsions that drives them to kill, but rather this comfort and gain that allows them to be a little bit more meticulous in what they do. Unlike the Aileen Wuornos, who was, much more violent and not as good a planner.
So in your book, you talk a lot about a cooling off period for serial killers. What is the difference between the cooling off period of male serial killers as opposed to female serial killers? Is it the same? Does it differ vastly?
It tends to be longer for female serial killers. And first of all, we should probably define what that even is, the cooling off period. I'm glad you brought it up. And that is the period that transpires from one murder to the next. And it's called the cooling off period because typically the person comes down from the stimulation and sometimes even a psychological high that they get from killing and blend back into a rather normal seeming life. Now, typically, this cooling off period will last a matter of weeks, perhaps months. In the most rare of instances, it was a male a male serial killer. His name is Dennis Rader. He called himself bind, torture, kill because that's what he did to his victims. Some of your audience may be familiar with Dennis Rader. He actually would go years in between killing. That's highly, highly unusual. But females, once again, because they're killing for different reasons and not necessarily this physical compulsion that goes with the desires of men, where theirs is more materialistic in nature, the cooling off period tends to be a little bit longer until they find their next perfect victim. I'm going to exploit this person, like Dorothea Puente, the rooming house. I need to find my next perfect victim that I can rob, that I can defraud, and then ultimately kill. So that's why I believe for women the cooling off period is a bit longer.
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot more planning that kind of goes into females whenever they're.
Yeah, it's not as driven by an internal compulsion. With men, it's more this hunger that has to be satisfied. In fact, using Dennis Rader again, he didn't even understand this tremendous hunger that would rise up inside of him to kill. He gave it a name. He called it Factor X because it baffled him. But he knew that when that hunger rose up, it would reach a tipping point that he couldn't stop it. It compelled him to kill.
Could you share a couple of notable case studies of female serial killers and what we can kind of learn from that?
Yeah, sure. Well, we've talked a bit about Aileen Wuornos, and she, once again, is probably the most infamous of all female serial killers of all time, and this is an individual that would fit into a category, psychological category of a sociopath. And for your audience, you often hear the terms psychopath and sociopath, and they're used interchangeably, but I'm here to tell you there is a real distinction between the two. And sociopaths are made and psychopaths are born. So it gets back to this whole nature versus nurture thing again. A psychopath is born with a brain that simply doesn't function the same way that a normal brain does. It can't connect emotionally with other people. A psychopath is incapable of real feelings such as shame, guilt, remorse, even fear, which is why they can be cold-blooded killing machines, and they're just disconnected to other people, and they don't have impulse control. The normal impulse control in a normal human brain is just non-existent in a psychopath. A sociopath is different. A sociopath is an individual who is born with a normal functioning human brain, but these individuals often experience tremendous trauma, abuse, neglect, torture, and torment throughout their lives, and they become conditioned or socialized, hence the term sociopath, into predatory behavior like that themselves. And that's Aileen Wuornos. If you look at her history, if you look at her background, she was brutalized throughout her life, and she became trained and conditioned to protect herself and to retaliate in a violent way. So this is an individual who was not born a serial killer. She was conditioned into it. And some people when they suffer abuse, they become very despondent and withdrawn and depressed and don't fight back. Others will fight back. And so Aileen Wuornos was an individual who finally reached a point where she said, I'm not going to take it anymore, and I'm going to take matters into my own hands and get justice in my own way. So she, once again, is somewhat atypical. She's fascinating because she kind of defies the stereotype of what a a woman, just the female gender, what the norms and characteristics of in our society being a woman, she was violating that, but she was even violating the normal standards of a female serial killer, which is why I think it's so fascinating. But what we can learn from this case is how people will adapt, to extreme torture and torment. There are various ways of responding. And it's sad. If you look at Aileen Wuornos, it's actually a tragic case. Yes, she killed 7 men. She did. And that is obviously, morally, legally wrong in every way. But at the same time, you kind of have to feel for this woman because she had been so brutalized that in her mind, she was protecting herself. So it's a fascinating case. It's not unlike battered woman syndrome. Some of your audience may be familiar with cases where, and the most famous was from back in the 1980s, was the burning bed, where a woman who had been just brutalized by her spouse for years and years and years took matter into her own hands and ultimately burned her husband in bed while he was sleeping. Now, she was charged with murder, but she used the defense of battered woman syndrome in that she had been tortured and tormented over such a period of time that she believed that she was protecting herself, even though he was sleeping at that time. And she could not make any distinction between when she had a direct imminent, immediate threat, he was breaking her bones, beating her, and when he was lying in wait and passively sleeping. So it's not unlike that. It's actually a very fascinating phenomenon and tragic in many ways.
What drew you to study the psychology of serial killers?
I've always been fascinated by the human condition, and I'm fascinated by why people do good things, and I'm also fascinated by why people do bad things. And I actually spent about 20 years of my professional career, when I first started out, in the world of advertising, media, and marketing. And because I was drawn to why people make a brand decision to buy Coca-Cola versus Pepsi or the other way around. And but after 9/11 happened, I was living in New York City, and like many people, I was very affected by that. And I decided, you know what? I want to understand why people do very bad things. So I went back to school, got a master's degree and a Ph.D., and I began to study the opposite, the dark side of the human condition. What would lead people to inflict a terrible act like 9/11 or become a serial killer? And the more that I studied it, the more that I got into it, I also became fascinated by why some of these individuals become like pop culture icons. Why is Ted Bundy a fixture in our culture? Why is Jeffrey Dahmer? In fact, Jeffrey Dahmer probably is the greatest example of an individual who, although he was apprehended back in the early 1990s, he stood the test of time, and he still represents this symbol of evil even today. And I'll take it a step further. Is I was interested in why people become obsessed to the extent that they almost not only sensationalize, but in some ways even glorify and celebrate the acts of these individuals. Believe it or not, you can buy Jeffrey Dahmer cookbooks. Now, if you know about Jeffrey Dahmer, he was a cannibal. So people are actually making money off of creating Jeffrey Dahmer cookbooks. There are Jeffrey Dahmer songbooks and poetry. There are action figures. There's all kinds of stuff that you can buy that people are actually gaining a profit by exploiting these stories and exploiting the victims and the people who were harmed by all of this. And I think that is just outrageous and wrong. And I became fascinated to try to understand this, because serial killers, they really are such an iconic symbol of evil in our society that it has so many tentacles to it. I mean, even to the extent that it's part of the economy. And I just trained in my background in psychology and sociology. This just fascinated me. So I study serial killers from the standpoint of why they do what they do, but also why then they have become these almost like fixtures of evil in our popular culture that rivals even things like Freddy Krueger, or Hannibal Lecter, or Michael Myers in Halloween. They're like larger than life. They become these larger than life ghouls. And that fascinated me. So that's what I've spent the last 15 years or so studying the serial killers themselves, and then also studying why we seem to be so drawn to these stories.
Interesting.
Why do you think it is that the media chooses not to really portray female serial killers as much as they do their male counterparts?
Well, first of all, there's far fewer of them. There are far fewer of them, and the reason is the stories, I guess you would say, are just not as interesting. When you have someone on a homicidal rampage who's strangling and doing horrible things to their victims, like BTK and others did, torture, torment, all sort of heinous things. I guess the stories just lend themselves to sensationalism, to a much greater extent. Somebody who's passively killing someone, by poison, and it's in a more rare instance. It just doesn't lend itself to the sensationalized nature that the news media often require. There's an old adage in the news media that says, if it bleeds, it leads, meaning the more sensationalized it is, the more people are going to tune in and be riveted to it. Well, the male serial killer stories are more, for lack of a better word, gruesome and juicy in that regard. They're ripe for sensationalization.
Well, this has been an extremely interesting conversation, and I could literally talk to you all day long about all of this stuff. I'm extremely fascinated with the psychology of serial killers and, just like you, why we idolize them so much. But unfortunately, we are out of time. So we will definitely have to continue this conversation another time. But first, I did want to thank you on behalf of the Barn and the Tippy Joe Show for sitting down with us and kind of going over some things. We definitely appreciate that. Absolutely.
It's been my pleasure. And, I hope to see folks at City Winery. I'm excited to come into town and look forward to meeting everyone.
Yeah, we're really excited to catch that show, too.
You be safe on your travels as well.
I appreciate that. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Dr. Scott Bonn is on the road. You can visit docbonn.com to find a date near you and purchase tickets. August 4th, you can find Doc Bonn at the City Winery, St. Louis. That's DOCBONN.com for tour dates and ticket purchases.